Hi, Psych250 students. I'm back, and this time we're going to talk about trauma and stress-related disorders. Chapter 5. Here we go. I've got my Pink Freud t-shirt on today. And speaking of Freud at the crossroads, right? Psychoanalysis calms people down, but so does a fish tank, right? And that's why some medical offices and some dental offices have fish tanks in there. Now, they don't have piranhas in there. They have fish because if you've ever owned an aquarium, it could be a very calming effect. So let's talk about what we're going to discuss today, stressors and stress. Most of us, we know stress. Stress is our middle name, especially during these times. Watching this video might be stressful to you, right, as opposed to a live class. Stress is not necessarily a bad thing. It just forces us to adapt and to change. Now, if we're ready for that adaptation or change, it's not really stressful. But if it catches us off guard, it's extremely stressful. So, what are some of the leading causes of stress? Well, you already know this, right? Money issues, work. How can we have money if we can't work, right? The economy, all kinds of responsibilities that we have, family issues, right? Those responsibilities, those obligations, if you recall, with great power comes great responsibility. But some of us have great responsibility and we don't feel like we have any power at all. Very stressful. Some people get stressed because they have so much money they don't know how to spend it. Most of us don't have that problem, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about adjustment disorders. We're talking about acute stress. We're talking about post-traumatic stress. We're talking about all kinds of elements that are sudden or situational or perhaps long term. Let's start with adjustment disorders. When I was a clinician for 19 years, one of the things I gave often was the code for adjustment disorders. Adjustment disorders are very, very common. They can be mild to moderate to severe, but essentially it's our difficulty in adjusting to a new situation, right? Some of you might be new to remote education, like I am. Some of you might be new to watching lectures on videos. I'm new to making them on videos. We could be diagnosed with adjustment disorder, especially if it's starting to interfere with our sleep ability, our health, our mood. In other words, we're trying to adjust to a new situation and it's not working out, right? So the good news about adjustment disorders is that they're fixable. Most disorders are fixable, right? We can work with them. We may not eliminate them completely, but we can work with them. How? Learning to acknowledge the what's causing us the stress, identifying the maladaptive behaviors that were contributing to our own stress, and taking time to stop and smell the churros, right? We need to slow down our lives a little bit. We need to relax a little bit. Now, sometimes we're exposed to trauma, and that trauma can stay with us for quite some time. Some therapists actually have people re-experience the trauma to take away its power. Now, a lot of folks don't want to do that because they don't want to even think about the trauma. But sometimes, if you face it and you've got help facing it, it takes away any hold of you. It's kind of like that dark cloud that's hanging over you, and you know it's always there, whether it's a big paper you have to turn in and you haven't started yet, or a big bill that's waiting to be paid. you face it, you take care of it, you work with it, and it's not hanging over you anymore. Now, as undergrads, you know that there are a lot of things that can traumatize you. And the situation these days are increased because there's just so many things that can go wrong in life. That's why it's so important for self-care. Taking that walk, listening to that music, watching that movie, of course, taking care of your homework and everything, but making time to do something for you. That is so important. When we look at acute or post-traumatic stress disorders, we're looking at a variety of possible symptoms. These things go beyond the norm where people are avoiding situations. They are obviously pretty agitated beyond what the normal degree should be. What causes things like acute or post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, we always associated PTSD with combat situations, right? We always thought, oh, well, that's just limited to soldiers. But it can expand to other violent acts against us or even that we witness. For example, there have been some reports of PTSD with civilians who are around combat. They're not involved in direct combat, but they're around the bombs and the bullets flying, and they're suffering from those same symptoms of PTSD. They have long-term consequences and they affect our health so drastically. You know as well as I do, when we get stressed, it affects our body. And these could be life-threatening. There's some instances of how men and women react to some of the stress situations, and it varies. Some people grow up in communities that are so full of violence, they just kind of adapt to it. You know, there's a gunshot going off. Well, that's just the norm. There's a helicopter flying over looking for suspects. That happens every other day. Other people are completely shocked because it comes out of the blue, right? Now, if you have a family history, or if you have incidents of anxiety or depression, then you're more susceptible to some of these disorders, right? We see that communities are not all equal, right? Some communities, as I mentioned earlier, that's just the norm of this particular neighborhood. We know that women are more often traumatized because they're victimized more often. I know growing up in Detroit, one of the things that I learned very quickly is you had to have the face when you walked in the neighborhood. My neighborhood had homes with bars on the windows, not for decorative purposes, but for protection. And when you walked any place, you should be carrying a stick for protection, and you should have the face. The face was, don't even think about messing with me because I'm a psycho, right? When I went to college, I found out after about a semester or so, people came up to me and said, "Oh my God, you're such a nice person." And I thought, well, why would you think I wasn't? And they said, because when we first saw you on campus walking around, you looked like you were mad all the time. And I thought, oh my goodness, I forgot to take my face off, right? I'm in a different environment. I don't have to have this face of don't mess with me, right? It was a completely different environment. Now, I'd like to share my case study with you. And the name of the case study is called The Sensitive Dentist. It takes place in a city that I lived in called Lansing, Michigan. Now, if you know your capitals, you'll know that Lansing, Michigan is the capital of the state of Michigan. Now, Lansing has a big Capitol building that looks like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It looks like the Capitol building in Sacramento, California. A lot of those Capitol buildings look the same. They have an automobile factory there that when I moved to California, I bought a new car and I looked at the label that said made in Lansing. I thought, shoot, I could have just drove right down the street from where I lived and bought it right from the factory. Right? I was living in a different city at the time, and it's called Midland, Michigan, and I was about to move to Lansing. And I asked my current dentist, I said, I don't know anybody in Lansing. Do you happen to know any dentists I could go to? Because, it's kind of hard to find a new doctor, a new dentist. And he says, yeah, there's this young guy who went to the same school that I went to, the dental school, University of Michigan. And you should look him up because I hear that he's a very good dentist. And sure enough, I went to go to the dentist's office. Now, I don't know about you, but going to the dentist's office is a little bit stress inducing, right? Because at some point there might be some pain involved. And typically you get there and they ask you to get there a little early so you can fill out the forms. You're waiting in the waiting room and you hear the buzzing and the drilling and then like, oh, your anxiety. And then they finally call you and then they have you sit in that seat and they put that big lead vest all over you for the gamma rays, right? I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm already Spider-Man. Now I'm going to turn into the Hulk too. And then they put that little bib on you just to protect you, which means, the flying teeth and the blood, so you don't get all bloody. And then they start poking and checking and they're like, oh, does this hurt? And you can't even talk because your mouth is full of gauze and so on and so forth. And you're just so relieved to be out of there, right? So I'm expecting this. Sure enough, they give me the form and I fill it out. They take it, they call my name and say, okay, here we go, torture time, right? And they take me to a different waiting room. And this waiting room is kind of dark and it's got a couch and some chairs and then there's nobody else in there and a table. And they had me sit there and I thought, that's weird. I'm used to going right straight to the chair, the electric chair and the lead vest and all that. This is not an examining room at all. This is just like another living room. So I'm waiting there, and in comes the dentist. Now, the dentist happens to be Asian American. He's Japanese American, I find out. He's got his white dental lab coat on, and he's got a clipboard in his hand. And he sits down and he introduces himself. He says, would you like to have some coffee or some tea? I'm thinking, okay, is this a trick question? Do I say yes? And he says, oh, that's bad for your teeth. And I happen to love tea. I'm not a coffee man myself, but I said, sure. And so he gets himself a cup of tea and he gives me a cup of tea and we're drinking the tea and we just start talking. And he looks at his clipboard and he says, how would you rate your teeth from 0 to 10? 0 being like rotten and falling out and 10 being perfection. And I've never had anybody ask me that. So I said, I guess I'd give myself an 8. I figure that's a B, so that's passing, right? So we start talking and just talking about my mouth and my needs and at some point, we're drinking the tea and I said, hey doctor, I just want to tell you this is wonderful. I said, I've never had this experience with a dentist where we just didn't go right straight to the chair and right straight to the drilling and x-rays and all that. We're just having a conversation. He says, you know why I'm doing this? I said, no. He says, I'm Asian American, I'm Japanese American, but a lot of my patients are veterans, and they're veterans of the Vietnam War. And when they walk in, the first thing they see is this Asian man about to, at least in their mind, give them pain. And they think the Viet Cong. And so I do this with all my new patients, regardless of who they are, to calm them down before we even get to the x-rays, etc. I thought, this dentist is so smart. He must have had Psych 250 abnormal psychology. He must know about PTSD. The sensitive dentist. See you next time.